first of all, Professor Ruud are going to make the synthesis, I guess, and then they are going to the questions.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to be here in a real physical environment again, because for the last 2 years we've been sitting behind this computer, nodding to each other, not being able to interact really the way which is so nice on these conferences, being able to talk to each other, being able to have a meal with each other, to have these informal sessions where you could debate much better than online. So I'm happy to be back. We already rid of the face mask in Norway, but here we're still using it. But it was a relief to be back to normal again. So I've been given the task this morning to try and wrap up these wonderful talks we've had so far. And although it wasn't that easy to come up with a common denominator as to what I should talk about, I think I did find one. And believe it or not, I think it's the affordances concept that may be central. In various talks, the concept of affordances was mentioned. So before I start getting into detail about that, I first like to just give a quick recap of what I think affordances are and how they are used in our literature. Of course, it was invented, so to speak, by James Gibson, an ecological psychologist that had the aim of making the perception process more of an interaction with the environment. So he wanted to get rid of the strict separation between an observer, a perceiver, and the environment, as was very common in the 50s, 60s. So what he invented, so to speak, is he put the observer, the animal, back in the environment where it interacted on a continuous basis, picking up perceptual information and using that information for controlling actions. So it's very much an interactive process. And every observer is built differently. So every object in the environment is perceived differently. That is the main aim behind affordances, that he brings back the perceiver in the environment. If I have a baby with me here, then this table, for me, affords sitting on. That's how I perceive it as an action. I perceive it as sittable, sit-onable. However, for the little baby with me, the table is too high. So for the baby, it may afford climbing on. So the same table mean different things depending on the body sizes of the perceiver, but also action capabilities. So in that sense, I've used the concept of affordances as the object in the environment is perceived relative to the observer. That's why I dug up an old experiment we did for many years ago, where for my PhD thesis I investigated cerebral palsied children, and in particularly hemiplegic cerebral palsy children, which meant they have a affected arm and a reasonable non-affected arm. So they have two different capabilities with these two arms because of their handicap, and they are born with this handicap. So from day one, they have to get used to this arm. So what we devised in this experiment here is that we thought, well, let our children hit the ball with either the affected hand or the non-affected hand. And then we measure the little LEDs on the hands of the children, and we measure the bats, because they have to hit a bat to hit the ball off the track, and we see how they initiate the movements on the basis of what type of perceptual information they initiate these actions. So this is a clip of that experiment. So then the ball is rolling down the slope at 3 different speeds, because we could have it at 3 different heights. And then we measured the initiation of the hand, and this is the affected hand. And they have to hit the tins to make it a bit more nice for the children. So what we found here is that when they were sitting in the chair, the ball was rolling down at different speeds. We found that they always initiated the hitting actions earlier with the affected hand compared to the non-affected hand. And we also had a control group. There were no differences between the two hands when initiating. So they initiated the hand at an earlier value of time to contact with the affected hand. Meaning that in some way or another, they take into account the fact that they have an affected hand. So they know from birth onwards that this affected hand is slower. So they need to start earlier initiating the hitting actions in order not to make an error. Now, we thought, now we make it easier for them. We take, because this handicapped hand was difficult to move from an information processing view. So what we do now is, let's take the movement aspect of the two hands away and just replace that with a little button on the arms of the chair. A little button here, they have to press with a little finger movement to move the bat. So we thought that would make it easier for them, because they don't have this handicapped arm to control, so to speak. This is what happened. So what we expected is that they would make fewer mistakes, because after all the movement component was taken away. What actually happened was the opposite. They start making more mistakes, and their pressing behavior, they were more variable. Because we argued, we took away this action relevant perceptual information from the task. Because they're born with this, they are used from day one to this handicapped hand and have learned to use it in all sorts of different ways. So even although it's handicapped, they like to use it because they know what they can do with it. So in the actual hitting actions, they were better than when they have to press the button. And that's at the heart of the affordances concept, I think. This ball is not the same ball when it comes towards the children. This ball is a ball that has to be hit with an affected hand or non-affected hand. So depending on what you have to do, you perceive the ball in terms of what you have to do with it. So that's sort of binding the action capabilities of children with the so-called external information. It is not external, it is relative to the perceiver. If a ball comes towards me now, I perceive it different whether I have to hit the ball with my hand or whether I have to kick the ball with my leg. I do not perceive the same ball. I perceive it in terms of my action capabilities, my dimensions, and what I have to do with the ball. So many people believe that the affordances are in the ball. Many people think that the affordance is in the ball, is in the object, which is not true. It is in the relationship between the perceiver and the object, because it's depending on what you have to do with it. Now that is where I thought this concept of affordances would be really nice to cover all the topics today, beginning with Audrey's talk this morning, where our oldest daughter was lying in her crib, rethinking that she was asleep, but was actually exploring her hands, her frame of reference, and accidentally touching the object. So finding out how far the object was in relation to her arms. So learning to know her arms, her frame of reference for reaching out to something. When is something within reach, and when is something out of reach. So you learn by exploring these things to not only look at the object, you look at the objects relative to your action capabilities. And babies, of course, have to learn about their action capabilities. They have to establish a frame of reference for actions, such that they can later, as you've seen in the last talk, can start reaching for objects. Because if you have to start reaching for objects, you have to know how long your arms are to be able to see whether something is within reach or out of reach. So this establishing a bodily frame of reference by looking at your hands towards your eyes, they're getting bigger, and the opposite, you learn to include them in your action capabilities. You all, as adults, the same problems when you start doing tennis for the first time. You first experience the tennis racket as an awkward tool that doesn't want to do what you need to. But at some point you start to incorporate this racket into your whole bodily frame of reference, and it becomes a tool where you don't have to think about anymore. You have incorporated in this action frame of reference. And that is also what I thought is with the monkey paper. I saw there that wouldn't be a nice experiment that if you presented the monkeys with different type of stones and different type of holes where they could crack the nut in, which one they preferred to pick out. I bet it is in relation to the size of their little hands, to the weight, etc., such that also they have to learn how the body works and what, because if we all do the experiment here, we have like 10 different stones on the table here, and I ask everybody, pick up the stone that you can throw furthest. It's that kind of affordance. You have to take into account your body size, your action capabilities, etc., in order to throw furthest of all. So you have to perceive the stone in terms of what you are going to do with it. I bet the monkeys will do the same. They pick out the one that are most tailored to their action capabilities. But we use also this experiment to dig into the motor behavior, because after all we were testing cerebral palsied children. And with these experiments we were devising in-depth measures of their perceptual motor performance. Because in the lab we had a parallel discussion whether to use surface measure behaviors such as the Bailey scales, movement ABC, which are very convenient and good to use, and there is lots of reference material. But in some cases we found that it doesn't go deep enough to find the problems in our children. They can either throw something or they can't. And that's a kind of very coarse way of judging. We try and dig a little bit deeper into, can they hit the ball on time or not? And if not, what is underlying that problem? So we have used surface measures, which are very convenient and easy to use, versus in-depth measures. Unfortunately, these in-depth measures take an awful lot of time producing graphs of the children hitting actions, and PhD students are working years literally to analyze. So this is a very expensive way of looking at in-depth measures of motor behavior, whereas movement ABC or what have you are relatively easy to perform. So what now if we have both? So we both, in these hitting actions, go very deep into the underlying perceptual motor problems, and we test the same group of children on movement ABC, various items of the movement ABC. So let's try and see how our in-depth measures compare with the more surface measures. If it works out that they both give the same results, fine. Throw away these very expensive methods. But if it turns out that with the in-depth measures we find different results, if we make a rank order, for example, for the group of children compared to the more surface behavior, we might have to think again to include more of the depth measures when we are busy trying to pinpoint how well our children are performing on these tasks, to provide them with intervention, as we've seen this beautiful research on trying to achieve some improvement in their development or learning. So this is how I thought that the affordances concept and the way we use this experiment based on the concept of affordances to dig into the motor problems, in this case these cerebral palsy had, and how we can devise tests that are easy to administer. You can go to the schools and take them with you, and has as a balance that you have to go deep enough in order to go to the problem. Is it a perceptual problem these children have? Is it a motor problem? All these problems need to be sort of dug out, in addition to having many scores to compare the different schools. So, yeah, that's what I thought I used to summarize the talks in one theme, the concept of affordances and how to measure them in detail. Okay?
Thank you.